My name is Pio Abad. My work looks at the social and political life of things. I'm interested in the idea of objects as networks of relationships, carrying interwoven histories of incidents, ideologies, and people. I work in a range of media, from sculpture to installation to textiles, photography, and drawing, in order to recreate forgotten artifacts and to imagine possibilities of social justice.
It's absolutely brilliant to see so many of you here this evening in the depths of the National Gallery, otherwise known as Gallery A, and for our next in our series of Unexpected View talks. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Projects here at the National Gallery. And I wanted to quickly introduce the series. The Unexpected Views are a great way for us to kind of invite artists into the National Gallery to choose a work from the collection and use it as a way to explore some of the themes and ideas in that work that might relate to their own practice in some way. Before I introduce today's artist, I wanted to first thank Hiscox for their sponsorship of the evening and as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to hold events like this or record it and have the recording go online and be enjoyed by everybody forevermore. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. I'm very pleased to be introducing Pio Abad. Pio lives and works in London, having first studied art at the University of Philippines before continuing at the Glasgow School of Art, and then his MA at the Royal Academy Schools just up the road in Piccadilly. Over the past 5 years, Pio has exhibited in numerous galleries internationally, including, I'm going to list quite a few because Pio travels the world, the Moscow Art Museum of Modern Art, Parasite in Hong Kong, the Centre for Contemporary Art in Glasgow, Gasworks in London, for which the exhibition we'll talk about today, and most recently in Cadiz in San Francisco. Pio has also participated in major international exhibitions such as EVA International Biennial in Limerick in 2016, the Gwangju Biennale in 2018, and the Honolulu Biennial in Hawaii just last year. He's currently showing in Dubai at the Jameel Art Centre with an exhibition called The Phantom Limb. And as many artists, Pio wears many hats. So Pio also teaches at Goldsmiths at the art department and is also a curator and has co-curated a fantastic exhibition of his late aunt's work, Pio Abad, at Spike Island in Bristol. So I do encourage you all to go to Bristol if you can't get to Dubai in the next week.
Or both.
Or both, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are flights from Bristol to Dubai. Pio's practice is concerned with the complex histories behind objects, often unpacking the social and political resonances of these objects through the collections that they reside or places that they have occupied. Working in a range of media to include textiles, drawings, installation, photography, and sculpture, his artworks originate from research into the alternate or repressed accounts of historical events, drawing out the threads or connections and complicity between incidents, ideologies, and people. Please join me in welcoming Pio for our conversation this evening, in which we'll be exploring some of these ideas. So, firstly, I want to ask Pio, why did you firstly bring us down to Gallery A, but also why did you choose this work? So this work is a 17th century Dutch painting by the artist Gerrit Willemsz Heda. We know very little about him, but it's an intriguing painting. So why did you choose this?
Well, I think when you invited me to do this talk, I mean, initially I already knew that I wanted to have this conversation here at Gallery A, not just because it's the hardest gallery to find and keeps things interesting, but I actually spent quite a lot of time in this gallery when I was preparing for my exhibition at Gasworks, as you mentioned, in 2014. And that exhibition actually became foundational in terms of how my practice has developed over the last 5 or 6 years. I was really interested in this idea of this space being a museum within a museum. I think at that time, it had just opened. I think my show at Gasworks opened in September, and this gallery opened in June, so it was just the right time to provide a little bit of inspiration towards the end of producing that show. And as you can see, the gallery has, this collection of work, and it's actually, the collection kind of functions as a summary of the museum's 400-year-old collection. And I found that really interesting, this idea of one room kind of being a summary of the larger institution. But also, there's a reason why the paintings here haven't made it to the main galleries. And usually there's multiple reasons. One is, the paintings here would have been made in the studios of the old masters rather than by the old masters themselves, or they're considered secondary work by the old masters, or they're kind of in the midst of transit as they're about to kind of go on loan, or they're about to return to the museum. So I'm really drawn to that circulation, but also this idea that all of these historical paintings are considered kind of minor works. And I think as we talk more about my work, you realize how invested I am, and my practice is, in minor histories. And also there's something about this idea of thinking about the museum as a play, and these are all the understudies. So kind of watching a play performed by the understudies is something kind of interesting too, I think.
It's really interesting then that when we were walking around, you landed on this painting as a still life, because in a way, still lives, particularly 17th century Dutch still lives, were made of these, a group of objects that an artist would have put together. So again, this idea of bringing together a set of players in order to kind of create a composition and create some sort of narrative, often a narrative about, as vanitas scenes are, this idea that, that our worldly goods are temporary, and we shouldn't be putting, it's a morality story in a way, that we shouldn't be putting all our sort of passions into these worldly goods. One thing that drew you to the painting was particularly the focus of the work. So the title of this work is Still Life with Nautilus Cup. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your choice of
this painting. Well, I think initially, I've always been seduced by Dutch still lives. There's something about these sort of different kind of exquisitely rendered surfaces kind of tumbling into each other. You have like this sort of silk fabric pouring into the gold surface, pouring into like what looks like a cooked bit of fish. And so there's that kind of this interplay of different surfaces. But again, like underneath that surface is kind of a much less triumphant history. There's a reason why museums in Amsterdam have decided to stop using the phrase golden age when they refer to paintings made from this period, because this idea of this phrase golden age actually negates the kind of history of subjugation, histories of oppression that have actually allowed Dutch art and culture to flourish during that time. So that kind of interplay between surface and also politics was something that drew me to the painting. But also you have this sort of quite ridiculous object right in the middle, which is this Nautilus Cup. And it's called a cup, but it's never actually used for anything. It would be commissioned by Dutch merchants to put in their cabinets of curiosities. So it never actually performs a function. But again, looking deeper into the material of the objects, you have a nautilus shell, which would have been found by Dutch ships floating along, the seas of Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia. And then you have silver, and in this case, it'll be gilt silver, which would have been culled, which would have been taken from, mines in South America. So this history of extraction being kind of contained into this ridiculous object is something quite appealing, but also disturbing, but also weirdly contemporary. We're trying to understand all of these relationships now and trying to place ourselves within this quite complicated, often violent history. So yeah, the sort of, that was the draw.
It's interesting because Nautilus Cups in Dutch still life, particularly in this time, are really common. So actually in any museum you would go to across America or Europe and you see, you know, a Dutch still life, chances are they'll have a painting with a Nautilus Cup in it. And it became this kind of symbol, I think, of the wealth that was really sort of being celebrated at that time, the kind of connections that the merchant trade was having with the rest of the world. So by pulling together these materials, you know, and also this idea of having something very natural with something very man-made as well, this idea that you could kind of create something that might come to represent what a Dutch identity might be around that time, I think is also really interesting. I want to just touch a little bit on your work and the way that your work operates in sort of a similar way. So here, these objects are kind of made. So you have the shell, which is seen as something very exotic, and then you have the gilt sort of the silverwork that's kind of made, and to make it into sort of this trophy or this cup, and then it's celebrated yet again by being painted. So there's a sort of act of translation that's happening there. It's interesting to kind of look at this more closely because actually I think this is far more extravagant than any of the other Nautilus Cups that you might see in the other paintings or that exist in museums. It's just far more lavish. So I wonder if there's a sort of another act of sort of fantasy that Heda is kind of doing here. You know, there's a sort of level of trying to achieve realism, but then also going perhaps beyond that.
It's a translation, yeah.
And you also do that in your work. I think there's an interesting, you know, your projects where you look at collections and then often take those objects and kind of translate them into other media. So everybody has a sort of postcard on their chairs. So I wondered if you might be able to kind of talk a little bit about postcards, but also the larger project that's kind of related to.
I think that the word lavish is sort of kind of a key aspect of how I make work and how I choose objects that then become part of my work. But again, there's always the scratching underneath that sort of well-varnished or kind of polished surface. And I think that's when the interest in working with collections come in. I mean, talking about the postcards that everyone got in their seats, Oprah Winfrey style. The sort of, I guess the project that I started at Gasworks in that show in 2014, and the project I'm continuing up to now is concerns this particular collection that actually has all these histories. It has the histories of old masters, it has kind of gilt silverware, it has very expensive fine jewelry, but then it tries to refract that through a particular lens. And for me, that particular lens is Philippine history. I grew up in Manila. I mean, I've been living in the UK for the last 15 years, but my formative years were in the Philippines. And so much of that time was shaped by the dictatorship of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, who, if you've been reading the news, are back in, well, Ferdinand is not, but Imelda definitely is. And I think that's when the project takes a turn away from just being interested in the form of the objects, but looking at the kind of politics underneath them. Like this phrase from Walter Benjamin comes to mind, and it also kind of relates really well to the Nautilus Cup, that all documents of civilization are documents of barbarism. And that certainly is true of the collection that the Marcoses put together. So for the last 10 years, I've actually been researching through auction catalogs, through government archives, through the back rooms of museums, trying to put together this collection that they'd amassed during their time in power. And recently that's taken another turn because they've come back into power. So you stop talking about the past, but suddenly the works have a different urgency. Like by putting together this collection, you're actually also putting together a body of evidence. Yeah.
And then through that research and through that kind of accumulation of trying to piece together what this collection might have been like, or how a lot of these kind of objects are now sort of out in the world, or kind of have been sort of reclaimed,
auctioned off,
but there's also parts of the collection which are still unknown or still kind of missing. How does that come through in the way that you present and create your installations? So, for example, if we can talk about the postcards. So the postcards feature images of different works by an old master in their collection. Where do the images come from? And what are the texts on the back of them?
So the images are actually from a single catalogue. So after the Marcoses were kicked out of office, Christie's helped the revolutionary government in the Philippines put together what was left of the old master's collection that was left in the presidential palace. So they actually then, through Christie's, the revolutionary government auctioned off these paintings. So Christie's then produced this catalogue from 1991, and I happened to come across it in my research. And it was actually the first time that I'd seen the extent of the Marcos collection. I think so much of, say, Imelda Marcos has been kind of sort of jammed into, a pair of stilettos that you forget the body of the collection is so beyond anyone's capacity to actually sort of lay them all out. So the paintings that you are looking at are from this auction. So they were the paintings that the Marcoses had left behind when they fled, but the better ones. So I think lucky ones would have had there's an El Greco there, and maybe I think there might be a Goya in one of those postcards. But these were paintings that were actually found in a yacht in Cannes. And the yacht was owned by this Saudi businessman named Adnan Khashoggi, who incidentally is the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi. So we talk about histories being repeated. And he was also very much involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. So you have all of these kind of different histories of provenance coming into these paintings. And interestingly, that kind of conversation about provenance happens again in this painting. So when we were researching about how this particular painting had come into the National Gallery collection, we found out that it was donated by a certain, I'm going to read his name, where is this?
It was
Claude Dickerson Roch, a gentleman who made his money running rubber plantations in Malaysia and Sri Lanka. So again, like these objects are not innocent in any way. They're the conduit, but also the witnesses of histories we'd rather not talk about.
What I think is really interesting, I just want to bring it back to the form of the postcards again. So when you show the postcards in your exhibitions, you have them laid out in a rack, and visitors are kind of free to come in and pick up the postcards. And what they do is you have them facing up, so you have them facing so they might pick up the images that they kind of like. And then on the back you have sort of different narratives. And are there all these and these are kind of quotations from different...
So yeah, these are quotations usually taken from newspaper articles. So they're pertaining to how these paintings were found or how they were acquired. So, one of them, there's one text there where it talks about how back in the day, Imelda Marcos would go to Marlborough Gallery and say, I need 20 post-impressionists for a dinner tonight. Go. And so again, like the act of collecting becomes something else completely. It's an act of window dressing, but also it becomes an act of imitation. It's Imelda performing the role of being a European sort of patron of the arts. And I think as you look at the different text and all the postcards, you realize actually when you talk about the Marcuses, you're only talking about, you're kind of entering a narrative kind of towards kind of 3/4 in, that actually there is a much larger history of empire. There's a much larger history of colonialism that this is all part of. And by turning them into postcards, I think for me it becomes a way of kind of imagining restitution. It's never going to happen, but there's a kind of like, I guess there's a defiance to it, but also there's a kind of a sense of hopelessness to it as well, that in the end, you know, all we have are these postcards. Nothing's liquidated. No one is kind of punished for anything. So it kind of, I guess emotionally I kind of go, I mean, I think we all do at this particular political moment. There are mornings when you feel defiant, there are sort of afternoons when you feel absolutely helpless. And I think that's sort of in the work, and that's kind of always been a huge part of the practice.
I think there's something interesting about the way this sort of act of translating in a way. So same as the way that, you know, the Nautilus Cup might have existed as an object and then get translated to a painting and then sort of celebrated and circulated much wider. So from an elite to a sort of growing wealthy merchant class. And then you do this another step further. So you take the images from the auction catalogue and then you produce these postcards, which then can be sort of circulated. But also you do that with other objects in different ways as well. So you have kind of, there's a project, I wonder if you could describe it more, where you've taken Imelda Marcos's jewellery and translated it into kind of another form, or kind of enlarged it into another sculpture that might also reference sort of something else, so like a body or something. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think a huge part of this project has been reproduction and trying to find different ways to reproduce, you know, turning images into objects in a kind of formal way. And one of the projects that is part of this kind of 10-year Marcos reconstruction project is a project I've been doing with my wife, Frances Wadsworth-Jones, who luckily is a jewelry designer, a very good one. And so we've been recreating Imelda Marcos's jewelry as 3D prints. And it's kind of interesting how that sort of happened, because I got access to the images of the jewelry. Again, there was supposed to be an auction, but it never happened. This jewelry was photographed, but the photographs were never released. But I got access to it. But because of the current political climate, I couldn't use the photographs. So we went through this process of what to do with it. And the kind of, in a way, the best solution was to actually transform them to reconstruct them digitally from single photographs. And so there was this process of actually creating 3D files and then printing them. So in a way, like they're as printed as the postcards. It's another way of printing. But then it talks about, I think if the postcards are about distribution, there's an element of like ghostliness or spectrality to these objects. And that's kind of, yeah, that's the current show that we're showing in Dubai. You know, like this, yeah, reconstructing these luxurious items as, not just as evidence, but sort of strange effigies.
I wonder also if through this research and through that act of kind of translating and presenting, again, you know, there's a mass of objects, this quite lavish and quite extraordinary collection. It kind of, I mean, it makes me think about, well, why are the Marcoses collecting in this way? You know, what does it mean at that particular moment for the Philippines to have a ruling family who are collecting, you know, old masters? You know, there's no sort of connection in terms of heritage in that way.
No.
So what's the draw? And it could be something about aspiration. And I wondered, you know, in a way, that's kind of how a lot of Dutch merchants were also collecting these objects.
How collections emerge, right? In general,
it's this idea of aspiring to kind of show wealth, to kind of exactly what the kind of vanitas still life paintings are kind of warning against. And that kind of comes into this idea of the sort of post-colonial narrative.
Yeah, I was reading this description of imperialism, which I thought was really interesting. It talked about imperialism as this process of disassociating well-documented objects from undocumented narratives and people. And I thought that was quite a beautiful way of basically summarizing, civilization as we know it. And also quite as a process, as a kind of photographic process or as an image-making process, it's kind of an interesting challenge to an artist that, you, in a way, for me, making art is actually about asserting these associations that so many institutions have tried to put under the rug in silence. And there's something there about kind of, image making and,
So one of the interesting things about this painting in the collection is that we don't really know exactly if it was Gerrit Willemsz Heda who actually painted it. And here we've kind of come to that conclusion because he worked under his father's studio. So his father is Willem Claus Heda, and actually the National Gallery have work of his in the collection. Ironically, it's shown upstairs because it's kind of noted by many academics and colleagues around the world that his works are of better quality. And it's interesting because originally I think this work came in as one of his father's, but it got reattributed to his son because it was painted.
Because he wasn't as good as painting silver.
Possibly. I mean, there's a sort of difference in quality, but I think there's also a difference in sort of technique as well, and the way that the images are kind of composed. It kind of brings me to mind this idea of the sort of workshop and the idea of the family sort of relationship. You've already talked a little bit about the work that you make with your wife, but I also wanted to just touch on that the work that you're doing to kind of promote your aunt's work as well, and how you kind of feel that comes into your practice in some way. The kind of familial connections, because obviously with the Marcoses we're also talking about a sort of family.
No, it's interesting that both the projects that I have on now actually involve family, and interesting talking about this painting in the context of that as well. And I think the way I see it is, the role of family in my work is kind of inseparable from how I grew up as a political person and how my art has developed over the last, few decades. And it's interesting working on my aunt's estate because it's become this kind of interesting process of running an artist's estate as artistic practice. And I don't really see it as separate in the same way I don't see collaborating with my wife as separate from what I do. It's sort of part of this, I guess part of understanding my role in the world, and also part of telling the stories that actually haven't been told.
So then I'm going to bring it back to your work again. So we kind of touched on so the greater project that you've been working on in the past 5 years. It's called the Collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders. And this has always intrigued me. I mean, could you talk a little bit about why the kind of title of the greater title of the project is kind of called that, and who are they?
I think this goes back to me talking about the Marcos history as going into a story 3/4 in. Jane Ryan and William Saunders were actually the fake names that Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos used to open Swiss bank accounts in the 60s. And so then you stop talking about their history just as a history of the Philippines. But then you start reading it in the context of capitalism, of empire, essentially, that, A, they chose these sort of really bad American sort of Hollywood names, and B, that actually it was this banking system that enabled them to amass this wealth, this sort of, this system of like shell companies, fake names, tax evasion. I mean, these are things that are happening now, and these are things that have been happening before. So the history of kind of impunity and corruption and colonialism is something that, we're still living. It's not the past. It's something that we need to deal with in the present.
So just thinking about that in terms of sort of names and labels, but also images, I think we've come to realize that actually when we look at objects now, I think this is something that your work does really effectively, that you are able to kind of relook at objects and know that there's these kind of underlying histories to it. So at once, when you see sort of a huge collection of old masters in the Marcos's collection, perhaps it's kind of, on the one hand, a sort of celebration of wealth, of culture, of civility, this idea of civility, but actually comes to represent something else, this idea of sort of aspirational precarity is even. I wonder if we could look back then at the painting and think about the Nautilus shell, but also the other objects in this. So it's interesting kind of thinking about your choice of this painting, thinking about your work, but also then looking back at the kind of, the gold Nautilus, the gilt silver Nautilus cup really stands out. It really kind of takes up the central space in this painting. But for me now, with all the kind of the sort of the knocked over objects and the way that everything is kind of put together in quite a rough way, it gives it a sort of sense of precarity. And I wondered if you had what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think that's the kind of interesting thing about these compositions, is that they are these luxurious objects, but they're all in the process of collapsing. And maybe there's a kind of, this is over-reading the work perhaps, but there's a kind of allegory to the present that, the sort of, the glitziest, the sort of loudest, but the most non-functioning element in the work is the one taking up all the space. And, I'm not I don't think I need to explain that even further, but, there's reflections in the current time we're in, the current political climate we're in, where, you have these characters that, are so colorful and so entertaining and so shiny, but ultimately so lethal.
Yeah. And there's also something interesting about the way that it signals to that that merchant trade. So you've got, not only the Nautilus shell, which comes from afar, and the gilt silver, but also you've got the symbols of the sea, so the salt and the fish. But everything else, apart from the cup, is in this state where it's kind of fallen over or kind of spilling, so it's something that they kind of kept in. I think I find this painting really fascinating now, because the cup is almost kind of the thing that's is the most stable. But yeah, I think it's the most sort of
they all kind of gather around
complex,
it.
Yeah. And almost kind of the most contradictory in a way, because of the fact that it's so sort of, because it's sort of not of, the Netherlands, not of kind of that place.
But I think that's the kind of interesting thing about when you think about, at that time, the Nautilus shell would have been so fantastical. And silver, maybe would have been fairly new in terms, but the fact that it was turned into something even more grotesque or even more fantastical, it's like there's so many layers of fantasy, but also maybe denial that kind of was involved in producing the object.
You actually, talking of sort of the grotesque, it's interesting to think about the kinds of paintings that the Marcoses also acquired, and the kind of idea of where grotesque is in the sort of, in their collecting habits, but also actually in the kind of result of the regime, you know, the kind of effects of it and the kind of repercussions of it afterwards.
Well, I think we're realizing now that maybe
Yeah.
the grotesque, we think there's a limit to it, but we keep on finding that there's a depth to the grotesque that we didn't know existed before.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting.
Yeah. Great. So please join me in thanking Pio
note, yeah.
on the note of the grotesque for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to know more, please click on the link below.